Fortunately, as I said, I arrived just after the coroner had removed John's body. But when I was in his bedroom, I sat at Lucia's dressing table. Nothing had changed. It was a time capsule that went back to the day they moved into the house right after the war. Her hairbrush, her mirror, her lipstick was right there. And there was a poem about a prayer about how lucky John was to have married this woman and having had this spectacular relationship. And while I never saw a religious side of John, here I am reading the Lord's Prayer in his wife's bedroom. And there were framed prayers around the house. So when you were in the house, particularly the den where John would, only it was in the summertime did he host us outdoors, because he always loved to have a fire burning, whether it was winter or summer. So we would be watching the fire, watching the evening news in front of a fireplace with air conditioning running that might have been 100 degrees that day. But we sat in there, and it's too bad that you didn't have the chance to view that room, because John had his shotguns there. He had his pictures, personal pictures of what he had accomplished in his life, his ranch, the cattle that he raised, the airplanes that he flew, the famous people that he was friends with. I have not seen John's office in Long Beach, where Janice, and I don't know the situation with his death and the Toyota Motor Company's situation with how long, but the same type of nostalgia that John had at his home, he had at his office. As a matter of fact, he even, in one of the rooms at his office, had a hide-a-bed. You pulled down a king-size bed, and you had a shower. You had a complete steam bath, and it was an apartment that I don't think he ever spent the night there, but it was always available for him if he ever needed it. And so he was such a charismatic individual that it's no surprise that you are studying his life, because it's a remarkable story of truly one of the great Americans that's ever lived.
Did he ever tell you how he met his wife?
He did, but I'm not sure I know the details of that. They were married in the 30s, before World War II, to my knowledge. And I do remember one thing about Lucia that somewhat annoyed her. John would receive phone calls at all hours of the night from Howard Hughes. And finally, after this going on, because Hughes would have this phobia about calling people in the middle of the night, because that's the only time he worked. He slept all day long, but he worked all night long. So he would call people, ignoring what time zone they were in. It didn't give a damn, and wake people up at all hours of the night. And when you're Howard Hughes, I guess you get away with that. Well, you got away with it until he got Lucia on the phone one night, and she said, Mr. Hughes, I don't want you to call my husband anymore at 3 o'clock in the morning. He gets up at 5 in the morning. He's got to fly as a test pilot for John Northrop or for Kelly Johnson. And if you keep him up all night long, it's not good for him. And Hughes never called her back after that. So she gave Howard Hughes a real scolding. But the details of how they originally met, I don't have
Now, how did you actually first meet him? Were you just introduced to him from a friend, or?
I met him with Hubert Lauren, who John was in a group called the Sunset Club, and that's a club within the California Club that's kind of California Pioneers, and Hubie was a member of that Sunset Club, and so he told me about this remarkable man, John Myers, and I had heard of John. In 1967, the year before I met John Myers, I boarded a chartered DC-3 at the Burbank Airport. And I was a guest of my client, the Carlsberg brothers, and we were flying to Modoc County, where we were going to be their guests for what was called the three-shot honker hunt. And that was its first year that the hunt was founded. And we were shooting on a ranch that Art had turned into a recreational subdivision. So he was selling 2.5 acre lots for $2,000 or $3,000, and that started a rather remarkable group of men that would leave the weekend before Thanksgiving every year for the next 25 years and be guests in Modoc County. That's it's the northern county. That the county seat is Alturas, and the man I was sitting next to introduced himself to me as Jimmy, and I ended up that evening sleeping on the rollaway in the room with this man named Jimmy, and the next morning we were in a goose blind together in a little town called Likely. And we were getting close to our limit, and we noticed that the lights were being turned on in this ranch house that was nearby. And a little boy ran out to ask if the general would be available because his grandmother wanted to fix lunch for the general. And of course, I didn't know that Jimmy was a general, because he didn't tell me his last name. And this was the legendary Jimmy Doolittle, the man that was maybe America's most famous hero during World War II. And Jimmy Doolittle talked about Chuck Yeager and John Myers to me. So it was the following year that I met both of them. And I said to John when I met him, and I said the same thing to Chuck, I said, you know, I feel like I've known you because Jimmy Doolittle talks about you all the time. And that led to another Kurt LeMay. General LeMay was another, you know, they're all from that vintage. One of the funny stories about LeMay was he showed up on a freezing morning, and Jimmy and I were already in the dining room with Chuck Yeager. And LeMay came in with a silk scarf that was touching the ground. And he wrapped this thing around, and I noticed a stencil saying Lieutenant C. LeMay on the bottom of this. And I said, Kurt, where did you get that scarf? And he said, well, hell, he says, this was when I opened cockpit flying. So John Myers would have related to that because he flew open cockpits, he flew everything. And so these legendary famous people, including virtually every man that had walked on the moon, was a guest of the Carlsbergs. And I guess all of those men, that whether they were like Chuck Yeager, because there'd never been a man walk on the moon if it wasn't for us breaking the sound barrier to begin with, and there probably had never been a Chuck Yeager if it wasn't for people like John Myers, because John flew the very first jet aircraft ever flown. No one flew a jet aircraft before John Myers did. So these pioneers, and particularly aviation pioneers, had a remarkable sense of adventure and discovery. And my God, when you think that the men that walked on the moon are carrying shotguns, and you're walking right along with them, and they're no different than anybody else. They just happen to be the most famous people that ever lived. And they idolized John Myers, Jimmy Doolittle, and Chuck Yeager. And I mean, they were modern day Christopher Columbuses, but they still admired the pioneering spirit that these great aviators were all part of. So that's how it was all through that common association that I met John Myers, and he became one of his closest friends.
I heard that he had great integrity.
Extraordinary. There was John. He was the kind of man that could never tell a lie. His word was his bond. John was such a famous pilot, and before that, such a famous lawyer and the son of a famous jurist. What people overlooked was what a brilliant businessman John was. I mean, John was the president I think he had the Cessna distributorship for California. He was the president of Pacific Aeromotive, a huge aeromotive design firm, and did interiors and made all kinds of special avionic equipment. John had a remarkably diversified career, and allowed him to build a significant fortune that came from his wise business experience.
Did he have a good instinct about people?
Oh yes, yeah. John associated himself with people of the same cut of cloth that he was, and I never ever heard him say he didn't like anybody, but when you come down to, he was really only close to just a handful of people that since I met him, and they were all just spectacular individuals, and in my case they were all 10 to 15 years older than I am. So I was really the kid of John's close friends.
And they say a person's character comes out during the tough times more than the easy times. Can you talk about the character of John Myers?
Well, John, I think, certainly talked about character, but John said that his life was shot full of luck. He said, I've been shot in the ass with luck my whole life. And even when you think about the Great Depression, John, as a Harvard Law School graduate, was working with the most famous people in the world as he became a test pilot for the most successful aviation programs prior to World War II, then during the war. So John didn't know, I think the toughest time he probably ever experienced in his life was for sure the death of his son and the death of his beloved wife. Those were emotional strains, and he explained to me that he had no knowledge ever that his son could have been involved in any type of narcotic, and ultimately he overdosed. And so that had to be a terrible shock to John. And then to lose Lucia, that's really characteristic of him inviting his closest friend to come over and dine with him when he took his maiden voyage back in his own dining room. But a man of a remarkable character.
If you were going to describe him in just a couple words, what words would you think come to your mind?
I think the best description of John was that he was a true gentleman. A gentleman among gentlemen. He was a perfect example of what every good person should try to be.
He was from a mentor to young people. Young pilots always came up to him, didn't
They did. Yeah. To have an interview with John Myers, if you were studying aviation or you were just learning to fly, it was like I used to tease John that it's, in a way, if it wasn't for the Wright brothers and their experiment, John would have never been, if the Wright brothers would have failed, Charlie Munger said that, well, we'd all be a lot better off because we wouldn't have lost all the billions of dollars in commercial aviation, which is true because the airlines have lost, billions and billions of dollars. But in teasing John, I said that you must have been the Wright brothers' first pilot, and I think Abraham Lincoln hired you as his lawyer.
How do you think he's going to be remembered?
Oh, certainly as a legendary aviator and just a world-class gentleman.
When I asked Bob Hoover about John Myers, he goes, I know John Myers, I've known him for 50 years. When we talked to Baron Hilton, he talks about, he's like a loyal friend for life almost when you meet him.
That's right. No, those legendary men knew John 10 years before I did, and they saw the extraordinary character of this man. And what John was like, I guess you could describe him as like a fine wine that just gets better with age, because he in the last few years of his life, his memory would slip and he would repeat himself. The last week before he died, when I drove him to the Duck Club, he looked at me. It's about a 1-hour drive from Beverly Hills to Ventura. And 3 times he looked at me and he asked me where his dog was. When Gus died, Baron Hilton and I asked a friend that was one of the nation's most famous dog trainers, a man named Bob Sanchez. We said we wanted to get John Myers the finest dog that Bob Sanchez had ever known of. And Bob Bob discovered that there was a breeder in San Jose, a woman who had a litter, and she was willing to offer a female and a male. And it was John's, I'm going to guess it was his 92nd or 3rd birthday. And we asked another mutual friend of ours, Jerry Brassfield, if he would pick up these dogs, these puppies, and bring them to John's home in his helicopter as a surprise. So after the luncheon, which Barron hosted at LA Country Club, we all went to John's house. And there, these little puppies jump into the swimming pool in the backyard, and John just loved them. And he kept the male, and I kept the female, and that dog was named Ichabod. And Janice Merriweather has that male dog today.